Hi everyone, I'm here today with Greg from Deering Banjos, and Greg is going to show us how to set up a banjo. I have never done this before, so I would love to just, walk me through how to set up a banjo.
Okay. Well, the most important thing to know about the banjo is there's a very finite number of things that need to be correct on a banjo that are very objective. They're not subject to opinion. They need to be right or they're wrong. But there are other things out about the banjo and what can be adjusted that are completely subjective. And whether this way is better or this way is better or vice versa, it's totally a matter of opinion.
Yeah.
And when a banjo picker knows what those things are that are objective and knows which ones are subjective, he can be freed to know that his banjo is correct and he doesn't have to worry about it.
Okay, interesting.
There's a lot of people, particularly, not a lot, there's a few people in the United States that are like the experts, and they will charge lots of money to set up the banjo, and most of what they do is all subjective stuff. And I love to share with people all the objective things so they don't have to be told how their banjo has to be. They can work it out for themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's just a few lines that I start with because having been in this business for almost 50 years, going on 48 and a half years, I've had a lot of banjos in my hands.
Yeah.
And I've helped a lot of customers. I've had hundreds and hundreds of customers over the year come to me because they're having trouble with their banjo. And the single most important thing, or the single thing that I find that is wrong with the banjo when somebody brings it in, is the bridge is in the wrong place. Because the bridge on a banjo is not glued down. It's just simply held there by string pressure, and it can be bumped. Or when you change strings, you don't get it back in the right place. This is a frosted top head, but on some of the heads that other styles of banjos use, like the new Renaissance head, it's pretty smooth, and you can just bump the bridge and it'll move.
Okay.
So you got to know how to put the bridge in the right place. Dixieland banjos, 4-string banjos, have a smooth top head. The frosting is underneath, so they're very smooth. Bridge can be bumped. So the way you tell if a bridge is in the right place is by playing the harmonic note on the 1st string on the 12th fret, and then playing the fretted note. They should be the same note. If it's the same note, the bridge is in the right place. And on a 5-string banjo with a straight bridge, you check it on the 1st string and the 4th string. That 4th string is a little sharp. So what you do is you move just that side of the bridge a little bit. Try not to move the 1st string. Still a little bit sharp.
So when it's fretting sharp, so you're going to move the bridge a little bit away.
Yes, but if you move it the wrong way, it gets worse.
Yeah.
So you really quick.
You'll know pretty quick.
You know pretty quick. You got to move it the other way. So that's pretty close. Then you got to check the 1st one again. That's still pretty close. Now, that bridge is in the right place now. But here's something that many, many, many pickers worry about a lot. We got the 1st string on and the 4th string on. The 2nd is off. The 3rd is off.
Okay.
That can be corrected with a compensated bridge.
Okay.
Shub, I think, was the first one to come out with a compensated bridge. Very, very, very few pickers play, especially the top pros, with a compensated bridge because it cuts down on the tone of the banjo immensely.
Interesting.
So the huge majority of the top professional players play with the straight bridge. And they get the string set, the bridge set on the first string, and they get the bridge set on the fourth string, and they don't worry about the second and third.
All right.
They just let them be where they are.
Interesting.
And they have some ability to compensate for that with the pressures that they use with their left hand.
Interesting.
But most of us mere mortals don't play at that level. So having it set on the first and the fourth string and not worrying about the second and third string is getting the bridge in the right place.
Okay.
Now, if you're a picker that's just going to worry about that to the nth degree, get a compensated bridge, and then you won't worry about it so much. And most of the pickers that I've experienced over the years that really, really bugs them, having the second, third string, they don't play at a level where the tone difference between a straight bridge and the compensated bridge matters that much.
Okay, interesting.
So they can just get the compensated bridge and not worry about the banjo's not as loud, it's not as crisp, it's not as sparkly as it was, but they don't. But the second and third string are better.
Okay, interesting.
So, but as far as bridge placement, it's surprising how many pickers will be out in the real world and their bridge is a quarter of an inch off. And they can't tune their bridge, their banjo, and they can't play in tune with their band, and they don't know that it's that far off.
Wow. Yeah.
I've seen many pickers that have very carefully had their head marked to put the bridge back in the same place every time, and it was a quarter of an inch off.
Wow.
So because it's not glued down, every time I pick up a banjo, I check it. And like I carry my banjo around in a gig bag and it gets banked around.
Yeah.
So I just get in the habit of checking it.
Oh, interesting. So it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
I play the mandolin, so most of the time my bridge is set and it stays, but this is a totally
Well, when you
different
change your
thing.
strings, your bridge will move
Yeah, if I
because it's not glued down.
take them off, right.
The next thing that is a problem with a banjo that requires setup is the head is not adjusted correctly. And most of the time it's because the head is too loose. Heads will loosen all by themselves. If the banjo doesn't get played, it's just sitting in the case over the years, the head will eventually sag. The temperature difference between day and night can cause the metal of these hooks and these nuts to expand and contract slightly, and they can loosen up all by themselves.
Okay.
So it's not uncommon for the head to be a bit on the loose side. This head's not terribly loose, and the way you check it is you dampen the strings and you tap on the head lightly, but you got to start hearing a tone, and that's really hard to hear as a note. But if you can kind of hear that it's a little higher than this F sharp and it's a little lower than this G sharp, and it's pretty close to that G. On a bluegrass banjo, most pickers are happy with the way the banjo sounds when it's sitting at a G.
Okay.
A few bluegrass guys might want it G sharp, very few maybe up to the A, but bluegrass players will almost never have it down to the F sharp or the F. Whereas a lot of the Northeast type clawhammer players will like it down to F or maybe even E.
Oh,
They want a much looser, saggier head because they want their banjo to be more muffled sounding.
Yeah.
But developing the skill to tell what note that is a very valuable skill. It's popular now to use a drum dial, but drum dials, we've done extensive testing with drum dials, and they're not very effective at giving you a consistent head tension because the tensions are at different places on the head because of the pressure of the bridge. And drum dials are set up for drums, which are much, much looser than banjo heads.
Okay.
So when the pressure of the drum dial goes on there, the curvature that that dial's measuring is much bigger.
Yeah.
So you can have a much bigger range to adjust your drum head. But a banjo head is smaller and tighter, and the difference in the height and the bend is so low that it's hard to really measure it.
Right.
But if you get your banjo head to where it's sitting at a G, the way you know you've got your head tensioned all the way is to look at your tension hoop and measure how far this tension hoop is above the top of the head. And if it's basically reasonably even all the way around and you're sitting at a G, you're fine.
Okay.
If one side is sticking higher up and the other side is sticking looser, you should endeavor to loosen the low side and tighten the high side to where the tension hoop is an even height above the head all the way around, and your head is at that G.
Okay. Interesting.
And that is a real effective way of doing it. There's other people that say you should use a torque wrench on these nuts. But a torque wrench measures the totality of all the friction on this nut and this hook. And it also includes the friction between the threads on the hook and the nut. And you can have the same torque setting on every one of these hooks, but have a different weight of pull on the hooks around the head. So tightening your head and keeping the tension hoop even and getting your G means you got this head as close to perfectly adjusted as possible. The important thing about tightening the head is that you just tighten it a little bit at a time. You don't do a whole turn or half a turn. You just go around tightening it just a little bit at a time. Now this little bit that I'm doing here is going to raise the tension a little bit. You see, that hook was a little loose.
So you're kind of going around by feel to get them even.
Yeah. It's like right that one's not loose, but I'm going to turn it just a little bit. That one's not loose. And some guys that adjust banjos or teach people how to adjust the banjos say that you have to go back and forth like you're tightening the head on a car.
Yeah.
But when I watch those people do videos, they almost always lose their place.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're going like this, trying to say you're going to keep it even, but you lose your place, you're not really keeping it even. And the secret to keeping it even is to be patient and not do much. And when I like that one was a little on the loose side. See, that one's not loose, but I'll tighten it just a little bit. And you can see it's a gentle process. That one was a little loose. And see, it's natural for these things to get loose like that all by themselves.
Yeah.
They're not loose because somebody came in the store and took the back off and loosened it.
Yeah.
It'll happen all by itself. See, that one, I had to turn it that much before it got snug, so it hit it a little bit more. And you can see I'm just not doing very much. And a lot of banjo players are nervous about tightening their head because they're afraid they'll hurt it or they'll break it. On our banjos, on most all of our standard heads, the new heads that Remo is making are very, very strong and very hard to break.
Yeah.
But the Renaissance head, the fiber skin heads, and some of the other heads are still made the old way, and they can be broken.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen just like that.
Right. It'd take a lot to...
It'd take a whole lot more than I just did there to break a head. A whole lot more.
Yeah. A foot through it or something.
In the early days, before Remo did their crimped heads, when I did a setup workshop, I'd always tighten the head till it broke so that I could show people how hard it was.
Yeah.
And it would take a lot to break it.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
And it would usually go pop and scare everybody.
Yeah.
But since the difference between the crimped heads, this is a crimped head here. This is the mounting band for the membrane of the head. And until within the last 10 years, all the Remo heads were made with an aluminum channel here, and the head was glued into that channel. And that glue joint was all that was holding the head together. And most of the drum heads, that's still the way they're made. And some of the, like the Renaissance head that we use on banjos, is still made that way. But the crimped heads, and the glued ones, that's usually where the head would fail. The membrane would pull out of the mounting band. But on the crimped ones, where the metal's crimped down over and it's not relying on a glue joint, that hardly ever happens again. So having the head either too loose or too tight is the second thing that is important to banjo setup. So we've covered bridge placement and the head tension. Again, bluegrass people like them tighter than old-time people.
Okay.
The next thing that's important is to make sure that nothing else is loose. This neck is bolted on, and these coordinator rods are the nuts that hold this neck on. And even these coordinator rods can move from the expansion and contraction of the difference between day and night. And with the picker not doing anything, these can loosen up. So it's important to, once in a while, to take the back of the banjo out and check to make sure everything's tight. And I just use an Allen wrench. You can use a nail or anything that'll fit in one of these little holes. And you just put it in there and see if you can turn it. I turn that one just a little bit, turn that one a little bit more. So these were just ever so slightly loose. They weren't loose enough to worry too much about, but they were just ever so slightly. If this banjo went another year or two just hanging on the shelf, not being played or not being adjusted, you come in here and you could be able to get a quarter turn off of them. And when you have a loose joint here, number one, the banjo's hard to keep in tune because the neck's moving. And the energy that goes from the strings, some of that energy has to travel through the neck to get back to the drum. And if there's a break in the attachment here, that cuts down on it some. So you can lose tone from having a loose neck, and you lose stability in it staying in tune. You know, if you're up there playing and your neck's loose, it's not going to stay in tune.
Not ideal.
So having that tight, that's all it takes is tightening it. On some of the other brands, there might be a nut here that you might have to take a wrench on. And then on the other end of the coordinator rods, there's on the back one, there's a nut on the inside and a nut on the outside. On the one closest to the head, there's just one on the inside. And you just take a wrench and say, like, that one's completely loose. It wasn't even touching. And that can happen all by itself. And all I did was just slightly snug it. I didn't torque really hard, just slightly snugged it. The back one is tight. That one was just ever so slightly loose. And that's all that takes. So structurally, the unit is sound right now.
And no rattling nuts or...
None of their hooks and nuts are rattling. The neck's not loose. You got no nuts loose down here. On a banjo that's like an eagle that's got shoes for holding the tension on the hooks, we've got screws inside that hold those shoes on. And it's a good idea to get in there and make sure none of those are loose, because even those can loosen up. And that's just simply having a good quality screwdriver and going around and making sure none of them are loose. And I'm actually getting just a slight amount on these. Some of them are completely tight, but I'm getting just a little bit on them. Now you can see so far that none of this is complicated. There's no big mysteries to this. There's no hocus pocus. There's no, I know more about it than you know about it. It's just nothing should be loose. And it's really that simple. Now on our Sierra model or our Calico or something like that, they don't have shoes. They've got a one-piece flange. And so you don't have to tighten. Those screws aren't, those banjos don't have these screws, so you don't have to tighten them. Good times have these screws. They should make sure they're tight. And so far, everything we've done here is very objective.
Yeah.
There's no matter of opinion. This is either tight or it's loose.
Yeah.
The head is either at a G or it's not, or whatever note you want it at. The tension hoop is either even or it's not. Simple, 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 simple. The next thing is the neck adjustment. And on a banjo, that means an adjustment of the truss rod. And a fretted instrument can actually have slightly lower action if there's just a slight amount of bow in the neck. And if you hold the first string down at the first fret and the last fret, and then look at the space in the middle of the neck, it should be about 10/1000ths of an inch, or an average business card. And this is actually slightly more than that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not measuring it because I've done this thousands of times, and I can see the distance. But you can take a business card, and not all business cards are the same thickness.
Yeah.
And I can put it under there, and I can tell that I've got space between the card and the fret.
Yeah.
Not very much.
Yeah.
So what has to happen with that is you need to adjust the truss rod. Now you can also do this and push it on both ends and have your string already touching the frets, which means there's no curve in the neck, which means you need to adjust the truss rod to bring some of that curve back. Our necks are made in such a way that there's a curve built into the neck, and we pull it out with the truss rod. And you can tighten it past that flat, or you can loosen it up and it'll bring the curve back. Other brands of banjos have two-way rods where you turn it one way, it bows the neck back. You turn it the other way, it brings it up. And that's all to get it to where you have just the right clearance in the middle of the neck above the fret. So I'm going to make that adjustment. On our banjos, it's extremely difficult to hurt the banjo by doing this. But you got to take the truss rod cap off. The hardest thing about taking the truss rod cap off is not losing the little screws. When I'm doing banjo setup for people at a festival and I'm sitting out under a tent in the grass, I really got to make sure I don't drop any screws.
Yeah.
Now on our banjos, we have a 1/4-inch nut, and I use a 1/4-inch nut driver, and it fits down in the hole. And that little bit of adjustment that this neck needs is about that much.
Okay. Wow.
Very, very little. But I'm going to check it again. I'm going to turn it just a little bit more. That's just right. Different makes of banjos have different nut systems in here. Some of them you have to use an Allen wrench. Some brands you have to use a 5/16. Ours is a 1/4-inch. Then you put the truss rod cap back. Almost never do this sitting at a bench. I'm always out at a festival. And his truss rod screws, years ago at the Grass Valley Festival up in Northern California, had a guy brought me an old RB 800, which is a gold-plated Gibson. and he had gold-plated screws, and I dropped one of them in the grass.
Oops.
And I have a magnet, big magnet,
Yeah.
but they were brass screws. There was about 6 of us
Wow.
with our noses in the grass and our behinds poked up in the air, going through the grass.
Funny photograph of that.
But
I can imagine.
we managed to find the screw. And
Yeah. Wow.
So, ridge in the right place, head the right tightness, head tension loop even, everything inside's tight, truss rod's tight. Planetary tuners require friction to hold the string. So if you've got a loose tuner, it doesn't hold, you got to tighten the screw in the back a little bit. The banjo world is married to planetary tuners because the old original banjos back in the 1840s and 50s had violin pegs going through the back like flamenco guitars do now. So it's tradition to have that straight through. But the very, very best planetary tuners in the world are not as good as the best guitar tuners. If I had my way, all of our banjos would have really good guitar tuners on them. These are planetary tuners, and the pull of the string can back through the gear system. And it requires the friction of having tension on these screws to hold the string.
Wow.
Now, there's a gear ratio in there, and you have some advantage, so it works. But a guitar tuner is a worm and spur gear, and the pull of the string cannot back up through the gear chain or the gear train. So
Interesting.
if I had my way, I'd put guitar tuners on all banjos. My personal banjos have guitar tuners on.
Wow.
The geared fifth is a worm and spur gear, so it won't back up. It can loosen up sometimes, but and require a little bit of adjustment there. Now, all of these adjustments are objective. There's a little bit of subjectiveness as to how tight you want your head, and each individual player needs to figure that out for themselves. There's people out there that will tell a banjo player that if he doesn't keep it at this tension, he's stupid. But that's his opinion. Now, that banjo player might agree with that and want it there, but there might be somebody else that's been told he's stupid that doesn't agree with that. So a picker needs to learn where he likes his head. And I encourage pickers to tighten their heads a little too tight and see, they might like it better.
Yeah.
And if they don't like it better, loosen it up a little bit. But loosen it up too much. See if they like it better.
Kind of experiment to know
Yeah.
what you're dealing with.
But wherever they find they like it, figure out what note that is. And always keep your banjo adjusted. Another thing that's a little more refined on heads is when you put a new head on. In Earl Scruggs' book, he said, people asked him, how tight do you tighten your head? And he said in his book, he said, I tighten the head till just before it breaks and then back it off a little bit.
Yeah. Wow.
And that sounds kind of cute. But Jens Kruger has done a huge amount of work experimenting with how to properly seat new heads when you have to put a new head on your banjo. And he's found that when he tightens a head where he thinks he's just about to break it and then backs it down to his G, that head sounds better than one that he just put to a G without stretching it a little more.
Wow. Interesting.
Because the frosting on these heads, he thinks it adjusts it a little bit and it frees the head up a little bit. Another thing for pickers to know on the standard frosted top heads made by Remo, there's a huge number of people out there that say that because Remo heads are made in California, that they've changed the formula for the frosting. They have not. The Remo Drum Company has spent millions of dollars in cleaning equipment to where the chemicals they use to frost these heads and the emissions that come out of there are completely scrubbed from the environment and never get released. So they're using the same formula that they used way back in the 50s.
Okay. Wow.
Now the Mylar that they're spraying it on is the same Mylar, but made by DuPont, But the way DuPont makes it has evolved over the years a little bit. So the Mylar is basically the same Mylar, but it's a bit more refined now, and it doesn't sound the same as the Mylar made in the 50s. So it's still the same coating on all the heads. Now, you start to get into adjustments that are very subjective, and then the tailpiece is one of those. The tailpiece on banjos are bolted on, and they can be taken off. You can put different tailpieces on. There's many different kinds of tailpieces you can put on a banjo, and most of the aftermarket tailpieces that are out there can be put on this banjo. Our tailpiece can be put on almost any banjo. Whether one is better or worse is totally subjective. They're a matter of opinion. They can sound different, but whether this one sounds better than this one is totally a matter of personal preference and opinion. It's subjective. It's not objective. But because they're not glued on and not welded there, I actually encourage pickers, if they just have to try a Price tailpiece or a Presto tailpiece or a Kirshner tailpiece or some other tailpiece, try it.
Yeah.
If you don't like it, put the old one back on. If you like it, leave it on.
Yeah.
But there is an objective part of the tailpiece, but it's still subjective. Not all tailpieces are adjustable. Most are. Ours are very adjustable. And when I say adjustable, they can be adjusted in their angle. And the closer the tailpiece is to the head, the steeper the angle of the string off the bridge is, and the more pressure there is going to be on the bridge, which means the banjo will be brighter. The higher up the tailpiece is, the less pressure there'll be on the bridge, and the more mellow the banjo will sound. And that occurs when it's high, it's more mellow. When it's down, it's more bright, is objective. It is the way it is. Whether mellow's better or brighter's better, opinion.
Yeah.
There's a number of pickers that just play with it cranked all the way down. Bela Fleck has his really high off the head because that's where he likes it.
Yeah.
Does that mean that's the only way any banjo player should ever have it? No. It's just the way Bela likes it.
Yeah.
But not everybody likes it that way. So I encourage pickers to carefully measure how high their piece is off the head and write it down, and then adjust it. Bring it far up, play it for a while, see if they like it. If they don't like it, put it back to where it was.
Yeah.
Adjust it farther down, see if they like it, and keep records as to where they put it,
Yeah.
so they can educate themselves on where they like it the most.
Yeah. Experiment with it.
Yeah. Now, another thing that's fairly important for most pickers is to have the tension hoop all the way down sitting on the top of the tension hoop. And that's generally true for most pickers. That's where they tend to prefer the sound of their banjo. But it's not true for all pickers. Bela Fleck's tailpiece does not touch the tension hoop on the top. It's sticking way up in the air.
Wow.
But that's where he likes his. The higher up it sticks, the less stable it is, and the more it is subject to being bumped out of place. Now, another thing to talk about are bridges. A lot of different brands of bridges you can get out there. And like I said, the great majority, huge majority of professional pickers play with straight bridges. And the modern bridge technology was developed by a guy named Snuffy Smith. He started developing this back in the 80s, I think. I'm not 100% sure. Prior to Snuffy Smith, the only bridges that were made by Grover, which weren't really made by Grover. They were made by the Joseph Teller company in Bubendorf, Germany. Joseph Teller are violin bridge makers. And Grover went to Joseph Teller in the late 40s and asked him to make banjo bridges. And they said they wanted them made as cheaply as they possibly could be made. When we started building banjos those were the only bridges we could get. So for years and years and years, we put Grover bridges on our banjos. And when we started working with Jens Kruger, he goes, "Why do you use such bad bridges?" "Well, they're made by Joseph Teller. How can they be bad bridges?" And he showed us the Snuffy Smith bridge. "This is a good bridge." And they're made out of much better wood. So we were going to be in Germany, and we went and showed Joseph Teller a Snuffy Smith bridge and said, "We need our bridges made out of better wood." And they said, "You mean you need good wood?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" He says, "Well, when Grover wanted bridges, they wanted them cheap, so we've been using scrap wood on these bridges for all these years."
Wow.
So we got or Joseph Teller to use good wood, but they wouldn't change the shape of the bridge. So we started making our own bridges. And they're basically made like the Snuffy Smith, just made really well. And they're much lighter weight than the Grover bridges. And on this part of the bridge, it's pointed. And when you're playing it, if you get your hand on there, it's not very comfortable.
Yeah.
And I asked Snuffy Smith, because I got to know him before he passed away. I asked him, "Why do you make the bridges pointy like that?" He says, "I leave that there to keep people's hand off the bridge." But if you don't like that point, you can just take a piece of sandpaper and sand it off, because that point isn't there for tone. It's just to keep your hand off the bridge. But I also encourage pickers to try different brands of bridges. If they like a different brand, stay with that brand. But even within one brand, the bridges won't all sound the same, because every piece of wood can sound a little different. Jens Kruger keeps half a dozen bridges in his case all the time and picks the one he likes the best. If you play a lot, when you play and your strings are vibrating, it vibrates in the groove in the bridge, and it can wear the slot in the bridge right on the front where it's supposed to stop vibrating, and it can cause it to actually rattle in that slot a little bit. And if you can identify that by putting your fingernail in there and stopping it and playing it and see if the rattle goes away. If it does, you've got to re-slot your bridge. And all it generally takes is a pocket knife. You pull the string out of the slot, and you just take your pocket knife and you regroove it just a little bit. It's angled back down towards the tailpiece, and that'll give you a clean break at the front again. Your banjo, your bridge could, if you play like Jens enough, he practices 6-8 hours every day. And he wears bridges out. You can get it to where you've regrooved it so many times, it's getting too deep and it's time for a new bridge. But the typical player won't play enough in a lifetime to really wear a bridge out. But he might think, "Oh, my bridge is old, I want a new bridge." It's okay to have a new bridge.
And what type of wood are you making?
The bottom of the bridge is maple, and the top of the bridge is ebony. There's guys making them out of all kinds of different woods, and it's fun to try them. You know, a picker might find one that he really likes. Well, there's one last point I need to make. Most of what I've talked about is objective stuff. 95% of what makes a banjo set up correctly is all objective. Don't let anybody tell you that it has to be different unless it's the way you like it. But there's another aspect to any musical instrument, and that's the psychological aspect. On some of our banjos, on the tone ring, we have 20 holes drilled in the tone ring. When we first started making banjos, we didn't have those 20 holes in the banjos. People go, "Why didn't you put the 20 holes in there?" Well, we made 2 banjos that were identical, except one had 20 holes and one didn't. We did a double-blind study with the top pickers in the area, and they couldn't tell which one was which. And we did some oscilloscope studies, and all the differences in the wave patterns were totally above the human hearing range. But Earl Scruggs' banjo has 20 holes in it. And if you want your banjo to have 20 holes in it, you should have 20 holes.
There you go.
So there's a certain passion, a certain love we have, a certain magical element we want. And if that's what you want in your banjo, even if it doesn't matter to the tone, you should still have it.
It makes sense to me.
This is about being in love with your instrument. Another thing about banjos, it's really important. Banjo players are constantly looking for the Holy Grail, trying to find the perfect banjo. And they pursue it, and they buy banjos, they sell banjos, well, they never really find it. There's no one banjo that's the perfect banjo for everybody. And the best thing is to get it to where it's doing its best. And the real magic comes from here.